Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. It was great seeing so many of you in Basel for Art Basel. Basel is perhaps my favorite fair of the art fair calendar each year. It may not be the easiest city to get to, and admittedly, the hotels and restaurants, well, they don't quite hold up compared to some of the other major art world destinations. But there's something very special about the week. Not only the quality of the art, but really the history of the fair itself, and the experience of seeing so many people from across the art world gathered in one place. You run into people on trams, at museums, of course at the fairs, and at dinners around town. I often compare Basel to sleepaway camp for the art world. You see your colleagues and familiar faces all day long. In this week's episode of the podcast, we recap this year's edition of Art Basel with Elisa Carollo, arts reporter for Observer. Elisa was in Basel covering every fair there, it felt like, as well as the shows around the city. We discuss where buyers were active, how the energy compared between the blue chip material downstairs at the fair versus the younger primary market presentations upstairs, as well as the rise of Art Basel Paris and to what degree it's changed the role of Basel itself. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Elisa, thanks so much for joining us. Following you on social media feels like you've been traveling a lot before Basel, and of course I saw you in Basel, and now finally back at home. Thanks for joining us to take a little bit of time and help us recap the fair.
Thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure. It's usually the great opportunity to take a European trip, both for, collectors, journalists, and professionals. And there's so much to see during that season, starting from London Gallery Weekend and then going down to Basel and maybe extending to Hydra or Mallorca. So everyone has their own trip every time, right?
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, I think very rarely does someone travel only to Basel. Usually there's another trip before or after, and I think this year in particular, it was a Venice Biennale year, so I know many people did visit Venice before or after the fair. So I'm excited to chat with you about this year's edition of Basel, really for several reasons. First, I think just given the current state of the art market, one in which I would describe it as more selective than in the past. It seems after every fair, after every auction season, observers are really trying to digest as much information as they can to really understand and get signs of where things stand. And also, another reason is that simply it just is the case that fewer Americans are attending Art Basel Switzerland than in the past. Of course, Basel Paris has, I think, cannibalized Art Basel Switzerland to a degree, and we'll definitely touch on that more later in the episode. I think also collectors being a little bit more selective, they generally aren't traveling to as many fairs as before. But let's talk about your reporting. You described Art Basel as a market that was cautious, but collectors are still committed. What were some of the clearest signs in your mind that buyers were still active at the fair, but also being a bit more selective?
Well, first of all, Basel was one of my first fairs. I started in secondary. I'm Italian, so I'm kind of familiar with the ground there. And as you said, it was mostly European. Even on Monday, it was mostly even German and, close by countries. Even Italians, they maybe just came for one day on the VIP day or even in the weekend, postponing their trip. So there's definitely a different pace, and we know it's definitely a market that is uneven. As we know, recent auction confirmed, you said, great activity at the top, but the emerging and particularly the mid-tier are still maybe struggling. And, you cannot expect to sell out at Basel. And maybe you need because the costs are crazy to go to Basel to be in the main fair, the old G fair, the old historical fairs, right? And everybody wants to make it there, but for a small gallery, it can be very risky. So I think it's particularly indicative that, of course, we're always reporting of those big sales. So Azer and Weird, Jan Weird was very up to it, saying that it's the best first day in his life at Basel. And they sold this 35 million Picasso from 1963. Of course, it was a museum grade piece. So it will sell, and there's no doubt that it will find a buyer in Basel or, present it before. But I think it was interesting to see how the other dealers like Marianne Boeschi or Massimo De Carlo were also pretty enthusiastic of the first day. They've been maybe participating to the fair for over 20 years now. They know how it works, Basel. But I love, like, especially Marianne and also Massimo were like, we come to Basel to meet European clients and meet European institutions. And that's the key, you go to Basel to meet that market and meet those institutions. Like Marianne, we know she sold this Marie Lovelace O'Neill painting to a European museum, which is not necessarily where her works are that popular yet. So 1.5 million, still an important sale to cover the fair. So I think what I've been noticing, and I think then we can go, in the different sections and stuff, but I think the dealers, they're still doing their job in the right way, kind of prioritizing maybe strategic placement over the hype, or like, it's not a selling out of the booth. It's more like trying to place the works with the right collectors and institutions that you would not meet otherwise, maybe if you were not in Basel. And it's part of this readjustment or maybe expectations. And I think also talking with dealer, we see this readjustment of expectations and priorities when they come to a fair like Basel.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of the major galleries, as you said, reported strong sales. And for our listeners who have never been to Art Basel in Switzerland, it is not the same layout as Miami, right? Miami is a massive convention center. And when you walk in, the idea of navigating it and seeing everything feels incredibly daunting. And what's great about Switzerland is that it is a convention center, but it's across two floors. The first floor is the more blue chip, secondary market galleries and material, while the top floor, it's more the primary market and sometimes younger galleries. And because it's split between two floors, it really makes the fair feel more manageable and easier to navigate. And it's actually kind of interesting because visitors who attend the fair regularly, it feels like everyone has their own tradition, right? Some people start up top in the younger or primary market material section. Some start on the bottom floor. There's not necessarily a right way to do it, but it feels like each visitor has their own way, and that's how they do it every year. And so I think the last several years, when the market was really strong, both floors, no matter where you started, felt incredibly robust, great energy, crowded, good mood. I'm curious this year, did you feel the same level of energy upstairs as you did downstairs, where there's the more blue chip secondary material? Or did you feel like there actually was a noticeable difference between the two floors?
Well, I think, observing the dynamics between the two floors, especially in Basel, it's very much an indicator of where the market is. Because I remember very well when there was the boom of contemporary and everybody was rushing after the breakfast, going upstairs to secure the pieces. This year, I would say, of course, you said it, they were crowded, more or less crowded, filling up over the day, but people started downstairs, take their pace, looking at works and masterpieces, and then maybe heading up and find some good discoveries. I think upstairs there was more ambitious booth, despite this year, everybody was very conscious. There were very few solo booths, even upstairs, unless you were in curated section, which always deliver, I think, the most interesting part of the fair, those focus on something. But in general, I think, yeah, it really tells you where the market is. So I had people, of course, downstairs were very excited, and then you have all the reporting from their PR or communication offices, but upstairs are the real dealer that maybe they own the gallery, they run the show by themselves, and they maybe tell you by the afternoon, they are like, except maybe pre-sales, I didn't sell, or I'm just waiting for a lot of confirmation. So that's kind of the feeling I had upstairs. People were reserving, thinking, but of course, it was not as maybe 3 years ago that people were selling like right away, the first 2 hours. And again, I think it's also a matter of the buyers. And it's a buyer market, as we know, but also the configuration of the demographic of Basel in Switzerland. It's European buyers, which we know tend to be more, especially in Switzerland, They're older, they're more seasonal collectors compared maybe to what you will find in Miami or in Asia. You know, you enter Art Basel Hong Kong and the age range is maybe 30 years old or 40 years old. While in Basel, it's 70, 60, 50. So I think it's people that have been in the market for a while. They saw the up and down. They're much more conscious now, but they're still active. The Europeans are still active as well as institutions and curators that were around. I think there was a strong presence of institutions also from the US, also advisors that were trying to close on that side. So, we talk about Paris. I'm sure you want to also, everybody's like, oh, nobody's going anymore to Basel because Paris is much more attractive. You have art, but you have museums, exhibitions, plenty, much more than Basel. And of course, there's good, but there's a gallery scene, and then you have the food and fashion and fun. And, that's another trip that collectors of all type can take. I think Basel is still for the most committed ones that they go for the fair and they go mostly for the fair, and you really spend also days at the fair. So it makes sense. Maybe now the sales were closed, especially upstairs on the first day, And in general, I think that collectors everywhere, thinking also being Italian and all major collectors from Italy, they didn't come on the first day, as I said. They didn't come necessarily to rush on Liste anymore. So I think in general, once we passed this fall, more excited, there was an immediate post-pandemic that people were like, we need to go back. Finally, we're back. Now, people don't want to travel anywhere for fairs, they just want to also look at what they have available around, considering also, shipping costs now, it's not only for galleries, it's also for collectors. So if you're an American collector, maybe you'd rather buy in America. If you're a European, Basel is still the place where you can buy and bring home or organize something on the ground.
And so you mentioned Paris. Of course, we have to talk about Basel Paris because everyone talks about Basel Paris, specifically when they're in Basel, Switzerland. So Art Basel Paris, it launched about 5 years ago. I think this will be the fifth edition this year. I remember when it was first announced, everyone in Basel, Switzerland was talking about it and trying to figure out who's going to go to Paris. Now that Paris is in its fifth year, it's starting to mature as a fair. Many have attended. It kind of feels like it has its own identity in terms of what that fair experience is. And it's different than Miami. It's different than Switzerland. It's its own thing. You're in Paris. You can enjoy many aspects of the city of Paris, of course. Now that the fair is going to be 5 years old, what do you think has been its impact on Art Basel Switzerland and how the two coexist in the fair schedule?
I think it's very different fairs, People go to Paris also for Paris. People go to Basel just for Art Basel. So that's the main point. Of course, also Basel offers amazing shows, and I'm happy to, share. I had you don't see those shows anywhere else sometimes, at the level, maybe just during the Venice Biennale, not even in Paris. But Paris is the trip. Basel, it's the destination more trip, I would say, more focused. And it's interesting, that most of the people that were in Basel anyway, they were going maybe to Paris before or after. A lot of collectors, they just tag along with the trip. In Parisian Gallery, no. After I went first to London Gallery Weekend, that I think is still maybe not that known by Americans, but it started to get more attention in Europe. And then you can tag along and go to Paris, and Parisian Gallery are having the best shows maybe for the summer in that moment. So they're aware that people come for Basel and maybe stop by Paris. So I think they're complementary but very different fairs. And of course, this year Basel had this new initiative, exclusive, that try to bring back some excitement of being present at the fair. Now, of course, now all collectors can and advisors and everyone can just look at the fair from online and online viewings and PDFs before. So with this exclusive, that's something unveiled on site that you will see only there. I think they kind of still play nicely because, of course, we know how important it's also for galleries to secure the sale before. And they kind of hacked the initiative already because they announced the artists before. So, of course, if you know the list of the artists, you know more or less where they are. So you can put your name in waiting list. So it was half successful in its in its original ethos, I think. But it worked, there were amazing works, both at the higher level, I think. Of course, Alvina Rage sold this Picasso, 6 million. And of course, when you see Elizabeth Pato, where else it will be than David Swinner, unveiling the piece. So another million painting. But there was also very interesting things like you start to realize which gallery are going to work with other artists. So there was also a lot of stuff happening on the contemporary side of artists that had attention during the Venice Biennale or recent Biennales, because we are in the big year of Biennales. So it was a good initiative, I think, to bring back people like, oh, I'm going to discover something new. But I still believe that what is more interesting and I find much more created and navigable than in Paris or Miami are the created section in Basel. They're much more clear and much more like thought out, at least for my perception. I personally love feature with those rediscovered from the 20th century, Richard Salton had this amazing Swiss Italian surrealist, Manina, never heard about, just resurfacing, starting the market, still pretty affordable, like 300 mark, 1,000 euros max, the paintings, amazing work. Or like Prieto Trovoleta having this first Guatemala indigenous artist, Rosa Elena Gugurich. So you can still have great discoveries that make worth the trip to Basel. But I think when you go to Paris, you tend to be overwhelmed. I mean, the Grand Palais, it's a journey. It's a journey not that clear as in Basel, It's sometimes the curated section are upstairs or like some hidden parts of the building that not necessarily get the same attention as integrated as in Basel, Same for the emerging, in Basel statement, it's pretty central in the upper floor. And there were very good artists even there. I love this gallery art from Mumbai, bringing this Ritka merchant artist. But yeah, there was plenty of good discoveries in Basel, and I think you can still be more focused in Paris. That after the Grand Palais, you want to do something else every time,
Yeah. So we don't spend much time actually on the podcast talking about some of the other fairs in Basel. You have Liste, you have Basel Social Club. These are fairs that open up before the main fair. And I do actually think it's interesting and useful to understand how those fairs went and the types of work they were showing to really get a sense of the full breadth of the art market. I know you covered both of these for Observer. For these relatively lower priced works and younger galleries, were there a few trends or observations that you found interesting when you were covering these fairs?
Well, as you know, I'm also active as a creator, so Liste is really my ground most of the time in terms of researching and discoveries. And Liste has always been good on that, But this year, I was impressed and pleasantly impressed that it was much less German, Eastern European, conceptualism, minimalism that they tend to prevail in the past editions. It was much more global, with a strong presence of Asian and Southeast Asian galleries that brought new voices to the conversation, different aesthetics. I think they did a great job in diversifying the offering. But, it's interesting also that you get there and that you're going to be overwhelmed. It's the first day though, and you still have energies, but that helps also that most of the presentation are solo booth, which is a key point that we still forget why some fairs still deliver a more successful, maybe, memorable, I would say more memorable experience, because if you're exposed to thousands of group booths presentations, you're going to remember maybe that piece that you like. While you get immersed in a artist narrative and universe inside Liste or other, boutique fair that we are seeing expanding everywhere in all the art weeks, it's a different story. You encounter a work, you encounter an artist, a life story, a vision of the world. And I think it was interesting that a lot of works, there was painting, but not necessarily that, only painting as maybe some years ago would have been. There was a lot of, artists that were dealing really with the timely topics, very like about the anxieties of our society, considering also they are young artists in general. They're really reflecting on the concerns that people have today, and especially the youngest generation. So I think I found it very interesting that it's in Venice, a lot of practices where maybe engaging with, this change of perspective, maybe exploring geological and natural time instead of human history. So there's a switch in terms of like, identity politics or colonial politics that turns in a broader and universal level, which I'm seeing more and more in biennials, but not necessarily in art fairs. And it was a prevailing aspect of many presentations, as well as more like anthropological and psychological studies of human behavior, more than, gender or type of humans, more like how we relate with reality, how we relate with devices, how we relate with nature. So I think it was very interesting how artists are also switching the new generation that emerged at Liste. And again, I loved many of the presentation of galleries that maybe I've been familiar because I travel a lot in Asia. So, G Gallery from Seoul had an amazing presentation with Mon Isaac and Lee Man-jae, or like Cylinder with a couple of other great emerging artists in Korea, Jo-Wan Lee and Min Seo Kang, that maybe European collectors have not been exposed before, So it's still that I think Liste this year delivers something more, again, diverse and interesting also for the European audience or American audience traveling there. And in terms of sales, it's another rhythm. That's the mid-tier or emerging tier that we were talking about. If you price things under 10, it goes fast because that's something that people can think without, even under 5,000. I think it's really a sweet spot now for the emerging. People go fast, especially younger collectors. But it's not sold out, the booth is not sold out as we were used maybe in NADA Miami years ago, like first hour, like 10 a.m., everybody sold out. That's not the market today, But I think, yeah, we can get into that. But I think it was interesting what Basel Social Club also brought in. They're also at their, I think, fifth edition now. So it's already few editions that I've been doing and changing locations. And this year felt very ambitious. I don't know if you visited, Adam, but it was like this huge former office building. And they had so much things going on that, necessarily it's not necessarily good for the galleries because you don't have a booth and it's more an exhibition and it's more installation and people get distracted between the Sprite and booth and the away and maybe tossed stand and cocktails and ice cream making with. But I think it was very interesting how they explored this idea of anti-productivity and something against, the financialization of the market, something that you can encounter. It was more like, I really felt like, when the Berghain does their show inside, it was more like a club, like those huge clubs that are used in Switzerland and Germany, like dark spaces that you just need to wander around and experience. And the sound was very present. So they really think about that fair more in an expansive way with a lot of sound installation or videos. So it was really a journey, which we've been seeing in many fairs exploring, there's something that, maybe it's necessary when the medium changes, also the art. So if we have a more digital or media-based art.
Yeah, it's a really innovative fair. It changes venues each year, and you just don't know what you're going to get when you walk in, which is definitely refreshing and a change of pace from a typical art fair where you feel like you know the layout, you've been before, you know exactly what you're going to experience. So, of course, Basel isn't only about the fairs, right? There's an incredible ecosystem around the city, museum shows, gallery presentations, other art related presentations, and you did a great job for Observer covering many of those. And there's something that happens that's kind of fun each year at Basel. Everyone arrives, and I feel like within a day, people are discussing with one another which shows should you allocate your time towards seeing while you're on your trip to Basel. People are usually in Basel for just a few days, and so everyone sort of trades notes and figures out the best shows worth seeing. To you, what were a few standout exhibitions or presentations outside of the fairs that you felt like people were really talking about and were really excited about in Basel?
Well, Basel is always Coliseo Billionaire you cannot avoid. That's like a must visit, and any time they're always hosting those incredible shows that you might only see there. And this time there, Pierre Huguet, he recently had also a show, of course, at the Fondazione, the Pinot Foundation at Punta della Dogana, which was also very immersive. But what he did, Bayeler, was very, I think, site-specific. And I feel that he really made the space, maybe as only a few times as other artists were able to, but like something that was journey again, multisensorial journey, but also like breathing. It was like a living environment, and you had, to listen those whispering of the wind from the walls. So it was really a new experience of that building that it's a big institution, so can be intimidating for many people, and it turned into this multisensorial journey and symbolical journey into these alternative ways to perceive reality. The project was connected to his collaboration with Liste Foundation, so they're exploring quantum connections between quantum and art. So that requires a complete change of perspective of how you read the reality, not in a linear way. And I think it was very successful in that. Then I personally love Cao Fei. I saw her survey 2 years ago in Shanghai. More or less the same works were present this time. The Kunstmuseum, the contemporary side of the Kunstmuseum in Basel. But she built really like this labyrinthine exhibition between multi-floors that felt like different levels of a video game. So it was very playful. I think it was very successful for any audiences thinking about accessibility also of those projects that, they may be open for Basel or thinking about Basel, but they remain for the local audience as well. Those are institutions that are active with their own communities. And an audience that in Switzerland is pretty, used to go to big shows and consuming art. So of course, there was the Ellen Frankenthaler show that I think we, as American, we are very American based. We're like very used to see our works. There's an amazing show at Gagosian now, where there are really museum grade show works, but that's not necessarily what European have seen, and I think it was really bringing to Europe some of the best works you could experience to understand the innovation of her socket painting canvases, her approach to painting, how different it is from any other artist or their group. And then I ventured to the EC from this electronic museum for electronic art. It's a further down institute. Like you need to go there maybe after Tingeli. It's another 30 minutes. But I was very interested in this curatorial proposition connecting digital art with myth and ritual. These new rituals at the end of the world is titled the show. And it was a very great global gathering of artists active in digital multimedia space, using new devices, technology as an exercise, more reimagination, re-engineering, which we've been seeing more and more happening in biennials. Like the media biennial in Seoul was all in center to that. But even if we look at Massimiliano Gioni show at the new museum, it's really about that. So it was a great show. I think now everyone made it there, but it was worth to, and I recommend maybe look at the list of the artists because they were very, very good artists and were maybe not exposed to necessarily on a daily basis.
Yeah, those were some great ones. And so now that Basel has ended, we're not there anymore. We've had a chance to reflect on the fair this year and how everything went. I'm curious, do you feel like Basel changed your expectations to a degree for what the rest of the year might look like in the art market, or did it confirm maybe what you thought already, that we're in maybe a more disciplined art market and environment?
Well, I think we just confirm once again what we already knew. The art market is definitely not collapsing. As we know, global sales were those 59.6 billion for the first time on the rise since 2022, but it's not what we were used to. It's definitely restructuring, maturing, which at the end provides, I think, also real ground of optimism. What can come next? I think I want to see in that way. I think we need to accept that this is a global market that went through an extremely accelerated global expansion and financialization that never experienced before, in less than a decade, and accelerated maybe in 3-4 years. So this both led to speculation and, of course, oversaturation that was not sustainable. And I think now we're going just through this necessary restructuring, kind of resettling also priorities and hopefully core values that the art should be around. So, what defines value? What defines value of an artwork should be cultural significance, quality, and this also imaginative symbolic potential that arts can have beyond the price and to be kind of relevant, for our time, which we're in a very fragile historical conjunction. So it's interesting if we start to see less market trends on certain type of figuration or like the style and more like themes that are recurring and then maybe start to overlap also with biennials. So I think this is the type of art that maybe can help us to see both our present and maybe our past also more critically clearly in this moment of noise and manipulation, and maybe help us to envision alternative futures also, on how to get out of a system that maybe is collapsing. So I think the art market is going through the same as society. So hopefully we will go to the next phase that is more positive.
Exactly. Elisa, thanks so much again for coming on the podcast and helping us recap this year's edition of Art Basel, as well as sharing your perspective on many of the different shows and events around the city during the time. If our listeners haven't already, I highly recommend they follow all of your coverage of the fair and just the art world in general in Observer. And I know you're also on social media, of course, covering the art world and sharing your articles and news there. Where can we follow you?
Well, I'm pretty active on Instagram, being that generation. So it's Elisa Carollo. And also LinkedIn, I usually share all my articles even there. So those are my main channels for sure.
Perfect. Thanks so much again, and have a great summer, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Adam.